This was the installation of the Torklift International Torklift tie-downs on a 2019 F350. We started off by fishing a bolt fisher through holes in the frame. The issue with the Ford frame is it's a enclosed frame, and if you drop the bolts inside the frame, you're going to have a difficult time finding them again. The bolt fisher is a wire with a corkscrew end that you attach the bolt to and then feed the bolt through the frame using the wire. It worked very good. I was lucky enough not to lose any of the bolts inside the frame, and that definitely made the installation a lot simpler. Once the fisher has gone through the frame and you attach it to the bolt, you feed the bolt backwards through the frame and you pull it out the holes in the frame with wire. There are 3 of these on each side that have to be fished through the frame for each tie down. I want to reiterate that it is very important that you don't drop the bolts inside the frame. This was the first time that I had gotten underneath the 2019 Ford, and looking around, I'm glad that these fisher wires were included with the kit. So at this point, all 3 of the lower mounting bolts have been fed through the frame, and now it's time to put on some of the spacers. Holding the bracket up towards the frame, I decided there's a different way that would work better, at least for me, for installing the bracket against the frame. Instead of trying to fish all 3 wires through the lower mounting holes on the bracket, I decided to just concentrate on the lower bolt to get that started so that it would hold the bracket against the frame. It wasn't the easiest thing in the world holding the bracket against the frame, holding the bolt without it falling back into the frame, removing the fisher cable from the bolt without pushing the bolt back into the frame, installing multiple washers and a nut on that same bolt, all with only 2 hands. It wasn't difficult, it was just critical not to lose the bolt back into the frame. But as you can see, the bottom bolt was installed loosely. The nut was put on just enough to keep the nut on the bolt, but to still allow the mounting bracket enough slop and movability so that I can install the next 2 bolts. The hole on the bottom of the bracket and the hole towards the front of the truck section of the bracket both required spacers, which were included with the Torklift kit to take up the excess space between the tie-down bracket and the side of the frame. Once that bracket was held up, the spacer was held up, and the bolt was inserted through them both, it was just a matter of removing the fisher tie-down cable again, installing the new washers and the nut, and tightening it down just enough to again hold the bracket securely against the frame, but still allowing enough slop to move the frame. There were still 2 more bolts to install. Now on to the third bolt, doing the same thing, pulling the bolt through the frame and through the hole in the tie-down bracket. It was getting easier at this point, a little bit more confidence. Holding the bolt with one hand while removing the fisher cable with the other, and installing the new washer, lock washer, and nut, and that bolt, like the others, was installed. The last bolt to install was the top bolt. This one did not require a fisher cable attached to it because you could get to both sides of it. This was attached to the bed mounting bracket on the truck, and it wasn't attached to the frame. Therefore, I could reach to the other side of the bed bracket and install the bolt a lot easier. I'll say this about the Torklift tie-down system. I'm pleasantly pleased with how robust and well built it was made. My primary concern was that there would not have to be any holes drilled in the truck frame, and there weren't. It fit perfectly. There's a number of bends and brackets and folds and cutouts on this bracket so that it fit around all the parts of the frame that it needed to. Everything lined up perfectly. Everything installed perfectly. I was very pleased with the quality of this system. Now that all the bolts were loosely installed, it was time to hand tighten them down to take up as much slack as possible. And once that was done, it was time to tighten them with a wrench. But remember, at the end of the installation, torque everything down to the specified torque as provided in the instruction manual. I did initially have a concern when starting to tighten the nuts that the bolts would rotate instead of the nut turning on the bolt. But the star washer that was installed with the bolts kept them from turning. Now that the passenger side bracket is installed, it's time to move on to the driver's side. Both brackets are identical. They're just mirror images of one another. And the only difference between both sides of the truck is the driver's side has the emergency or parking brake cable that runs through parts of the bracket. They did not interfere with one another, and that was another pleasant surprise. At this point, I have already run all the bolt fisher cables through the holes in the frame as specified in the instructions. Holding the bracket with one hand while trying to fish the bottom bolt through was a little tricky. It wasn't difficult, but it was just a little awkward underneath the truck doing that. But there it is. Now it's just a matter of holding the bracket, the bolt, removing the Fisher cable without pushing the bolt back into the frame, then installing washers and then the nut on the bottom bolt, all with 2 hands. Again, it wasn't difficult to do. I was actually very happy with how simple everything went. Just be aware that you don't want to have your head underneath the bracket if you install it, to make sure that if it does fall, it doesn't fall on you. Washers go on. Then the nut. And now I don't have to worry about the bracket falling anymore. So it's off to the next 2 bolts to install. Same way. The spacer plate through the cable, or the cable through the spacer plate. Fish the cable through the forward hole on the bracket. And gently pull the cable out. Jiggle the cable around and the bracket until the bolt comes through the hole. You want to be careful not to pull too hard on these Fisher cables, because you don't want them to come off the bolt. That will drop the bolt in the frame, and you don't want that. Hold the bolt, remove the cable, install the washers and the nut. But for me at least, don't tighten it down yet. There's still 2 more bolts to install on this side. It could get a little awkward every now and then trying to remove the Fisher cable, just because sometimes it doesn't want to rotate. Remember, these Fisher cables, the coiled end threads onto the bolt threads. So it's not a matter of just pulling the cable off the bolt. You have to unthread it off the bolt. On go the washers and the nut loosely. And that bolt is installed, though it's not tightened down yet. 2 more to go. Bolts at the top and the bolts that are towards the back of the truck, they did not require any spacers. They went directly up against the frame of the truck. That made it a little better because it was 1 less piece of the puzzle to have to hold in place while fishing the bolt and the washers and the nut. Bolt number 3 is installed. The bracket is still loose because there's still one more bolt to go. Now again, this being the top bolt, it did not require a fisher cable to install it. I could reach the back side of it and the front side, and it was just a matter of installing the bolt, the washers, and the nut, and snugging them all up by hand. Now that all the bolts were installed, I could tighten them all by hand to get them snug before tightening with a wrench. And again, just like on the passenger side, before you call this installation complete, be sure you use a torque wrench and tighten every bolt to the manufacturer's specs. Now it's time to snug everything up with a wrench and then the torque wrench. And that's what it looks like on the driver's side. What it looks like from the outside with the tie-down extension off and with the tie-down on. Thanks for watching.